Well, hi everyone, and welcome to episode 109 of Finding Your Way Through Therapy. Um, I'm just very excited because this is something that I've wanted to talk about for a long time, not because it's a fun subject, but because it needs to be talked about. I've worked in the criminal justice, community justice system for about 15 years of my life, and I have seen some of the difficulties. But Lynn Kee is someone who contacted me and told me about even bigger stuff that I did not know about. Some of it I knew, some of it I don't. And she wants to share her story. She wants to talk about different things. I'm very excited to have her on. Someone we both know had recommended for us to meet, and I'm very happy that we're meeting. So Lynn Kee, welcome to Finding Your Way Through Therapy.
Hey Steve, how are you today? Just trying
I
to
am
get my hair out of my ear.
I am doing very good. But what's funny is I always, we always try to do a pre-interview. Our pre-interview was cut short because of like Wi-Fi issues and all that. So,
Oh my gosh.
but like I'm just an honest guy with my audience. But yes, truly interested in hearing more of your story. I read your story where you sent me some stuff. Obviously very excited, but they don't know. So just so we get that this is just not a Massachusetts podcast. So remember that sometimes people
Yes.
may not know people where if we say Leicester, they don't know what that means or spell it, frankly. uh So, how about you start off by introducing yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. So first I want to say thank you so much for giving me the opportunity and the platform today. I truly appreciate it. This is going to be my very first podcast of any type. Definitely my very
Exclusive.
first. Yeah, definitely my very first recorded, first time on video. I'm gonna take a you and me shooting the breeze, kind of almost like we're in a therapy session approach to this. I'm sitting in my comfy chair in my living room because it's a lot, Steve. So I am a survivor of childhood sexual trauma. I have or had, unfortunately, a sister, a younger sister. Her name was Amanda Hernandez. She was also a childhood of sexual trauma. And unfortunately, although both of us did receive convictions in our cases, we experienced a lot of secondhand trauma at the hands of the criminal justice system. And that's not due to the fact that, the people in it are bad or don't want to help, because by large and vast majority, they really are good people that want to help. It just is by nature of the system itself. So through that process, I uncovered that trauma is really the gateway drug, both for myself and my sister. And we both went on our own separate healing journeys over the past 20 years. Unfortunately, my sister lost her battle with CPTSD and substance abuse back in January. She left 3 beautiful children and a devastated family behind her. And that really was the catalyst for me to start getting out there and doing some advocacy and activism to spread the message, maybe help some people. I'm in Massachusetts,
Yeah.
born and raised, and that's about it.
Well, sorry for your loss first and foremost, which is very
Thank you,
important
sir.
to talk about. Um, Born and raised in Massachusetts, you grew up in Central Mass?
Yes. So I'm from a little town called Northbridge. It's right outside of Worcester. My family is originally from the Ashland or Framingham area. My father, Bill, was the fire chief in Ashland for a lot of years, almost 20 years, I believe, as chief on the department for about 30. So we have deep roots here in the community.
Well, you know, Northbridge is somewhere I know very well. I worked in Framingham and Ashland for many, many, many years. And so, it's kind of interesting when we know all these little towns in Central Mass,
Yes.
where the Dragons live past 95 for those in Boston. That's where we live. But I want to hear more about your family's story because I think that when you say trauma is the gateway drug, I think it's absolutely 100% true.
Mm.
But would like to hear more about your family story, as well as maybe more about the trauma, again, just in general, what went on, because I think it's important to share that.
Yes, sir. Thank you. So that's the whole point of this
See, military
podcast for
people
me.
call me sir. Sir is my
Yeah,
dad,
it's
and he's
it's
dead.
It's so bad. So I come from a military family, a family with a strong public safety background. As I said, my father was a firefighter and fire chief in Ashland for 30 years. He also retired or is in the process of retiring as a sergeant major in the Army National Guard. He did 2 tours of duty overseas. And he comes from a long line of military men before him. My grandfather was in the military. My father's brother was also in the military, went to West Point. My grandfather's brother was also a West Point graduate. So it runs really deep in our family. We're basically blue collar, middle class. Um, like I said, my dad came up in the town that he ended up working in, met my mom, who was also a small town girl, and they got married, had me, moved out to the Northbridge area, built a house when I was about 5 years old because that was the trend. There was land and it was way less expensive out in this area. So there were a lot of transplants, and it was also within distance that he could quickly get to Ashland in the event of a call or whatever. So my sister and I really had a pretty idyllic childhood. I like to say it was all puppies and rainbows early on. My mother was a stay-at-home mom with me. When I was about 3.5 years old, my sister was born. Like I said, we moved to Northbridge, and things were great for a long time. I have very fond memories of childhood. Um, Unfortunately, when I was about 8 years old, I suffered what I consider to be my very first major trauma, and that is discovering or being told that my mother was an alcoholic. I didn't even know what an alcoholic was. I had never heard of it. I had never seen my mother drunk. And I was blindsided. So I'll go a little bit more into that if you'd like.
Please.
Yeah, so at that time, like I said, I was about 8 years old. My sister was about 4 years old. And the way it unfurled was I was basically trying to sleep over a friend's house, right? In the morning, I went to wake my mother up before school. She was a waitress at night. And so she would often sleep in the morning. I was a pretty self sufficient kid. It was the 90s. So I went to wake my mother up before school and ask her if I could stay at my friend's house. Hi, Trooper. This is Trooper Rose, by the way, guys. Don't mind her. She's one of my coping mechanisms. Basically, I woke her up before school, asked her if I could stay the night at a friend's house. We got into a major fight. It was crazy. Like, she was just in a terrible mood, and she was so mad at me for even asking. And I just remember being really upset when I went to school, but she said that, yeah, I could sleep over Ashley's house. And so I did. And the next morning, I can't remember if it was before school or if it was a weekend, she called, and she told me that she was sick, and she needed to get some help, and that she was going to be going to a couple of meetings with a couple of friends, and that I was going to be staying another night at my friend Ashley's house. And that was my introduction into the world of addiction, essentially. Like I said, I had never even seen my mother drunk before, that I can recall. So from there, the real trauma began because with early recovery comes a lot of guilt, and my mother obviously had a lot of guilt, and unfortunately she made the decision that she wanted to leave my father. She at the time said that she didn't love him anymore, and that was very confusing for an 8-year-old kid. More so confusing for my 4-year-old sister, though. She had
Lots of
absolutely
information
no
for an
idea.
8-year-old and a 4-year-old.
Yeah. Yeah, she had no idea what was going on. All she knew is that mommy and daddy had a fight one day, and this was about 6 months into my mom's recovery. Mommy and daddy had a fight one day, and daddy was gone. Now, my father was never far, but to a 4-year-old kid, right? He was gone. Now, for me, I was just angry at my mother. I had no idea what the hell had happened, to be frank. You're an alcoholic. You go to these meetings. All of a sudden, you don't love daddy anymore, and he's gone. And things got worse when her first AA boyfriend moved in later that year.
Mm.
So it's a, from the get, Steve, it's pretty intricate, and there are pretty significant moments, but I can't go into all of it. So I'll just fast forward and say that that particular gentleman was about 20 years older than my mother, who was about 30 or so at the time. He lived above a funeral home, and when he moved into our home, he promptly got throat cancer and had to have, and that's no laughing matter, he survived and he's
Jesus.
still alive to this day, but
Wow.
he had to have his voice box removed, and there was a man with that situation being nursed by my 30-year-old mother in what was once my parents' bedroom. So I developed a lot of anger pretty early on, and that just continued over like a 10-year period. There were constant battles between myself and my mother. Now, the way that I was the type of kid that was a straight A student. I was very straight edge, as I like to say. We were not a religious family, but we were a Christian family. My grandmother, my ninny, as I called her, would bring us to church every single Sunday. We spent weekends at my ninny's house even prior to my parents' divorce, because my parents worked. My mom was a waitress and my dad worked odd hours as a firefighter. Um, so essentially, over that next 10 years, I just doubled down on school, and there was a real distinction, right, between myself and where my, I guess, alliances were, right, and my sister, and where her support or alliances were, right. My support came from my dad's side of the family. Outside of the home, I was constantly at war with my mother in my own home, and my sister was kind of in the background watching that, and she clung to my mother. So I say all the time that that really set the stage for what I believe, played out for those reasons early on, just snowballed over the next 20 years.
But all
Um,
this change at that age is a lot for any kid. And then trying
yes.
to adapt and trying to figure it out. And like you said, dad might be down the street, but he's
Hmm.
he's away.
Right.
And it feels very much different. And it kind of changes. You talk about I go back to something, it's gonna be a theme, I think, here is the trauma as a gateway drug.
Hmm.
I think that that probably is the start of, feeling a little bit different, feeling a little
Yes.
bit like shame, feeling like I can't talk to anyone about this because it's shameful.
Yes.
I don't know. It's just
Yes.
my thought. Yeah.
Yeah, no, definitely for my sister. Now, this is another key. Just the way that things are structured, a lot of my success versus my sister's unfortunate,
Ending.
death, right?
Yeah.
Her ending, right? Comes from, I think, who we were just naturally as people, right? So I, as the older child, had a broader understanding of what was going on. And I was always encouraged to be vocal from the get. When I was a little girl, my dad sat me on his lap. Literally, I remember this conversation and said, "Lynn, there's nothing we can't work through together. Honesty is the best policy. Anytime you have an issue, no matter how big it might seem, as long as you come to me with it, right? And I always want to hear it from you first. We can work through it together." And I really took to that. So I had a lot of people that I felt solid talking to. Now, I didn't like, yap outside of my home, but I also didn't feel shame about that. I had anger towards my mother, and I didn't understand um, why she was so sick, how she was sick. Because again, I never saw it play out in the day to day. I never saw her addiction. I just saw the aftermath of her sobriety, believe it or not. And my sister, on the other hand, was very introverted during this time. She didn't talk to anybody about anything. She was kind of again, she clung to my mom, and she really was kind of lost in a lot of ways. Now, that's not for lack of effort on the part of my dad and my dad's family, but again, in her mind, as a 4-year-old child, her father left. So despite his efforts, I think she always felt alienated from him, whereas he and I were super close, and I clung to him when I started warring with my mother. So that was like the basis for a much broader issue that developed over time. It's also funny how, my sister tended to act out early on. She got in with the wrong crowd and was just doing like dumb kid crap. You know what I mean? Like wearing makeup she shouldn't have been, clothes she shouldn't have been, smoking cigarettes, like experimenting with pot, experimenting with alcohol. Now, this is later on, obviously, when she's like 10, 11 years old. And I was just super straight edge, like terrified to do anything, because I sat in meetings with my mother and I watched, and I was never going to be that. And I could not imagine how that happened. I had no concept of the disease theory. And I don't to be completely honest, I couple the disease theory with a broader frame of thinking, and that's how I get my recovery. And I don't know if this was mentioned yet, but I personally am a woman in long-term recovery myself.
How long is your sobriety?
Currently, I have about 18 months. Prior
Congratulations.
to,
That's
thank
big.
you. Thank you. Prior to an accident I had back in 2017 where I really broke a leg, like had 6 or 7 surgeries over a 2 year period. I had 7 years of sobriety. However, it was sobriety, not recovery, which I hope we'll get into later.
Oh,
Um,
yes.
so
You're talking my language here. Trauma,
yeah.
sobriety, recovery,
Hmm.
and how the differences are 12 step versus non 12 step. I mean, that's all my language.
Yes.
I speak those languages.
Yes, and that's why I'm here, Steve. That's why I said I'm trying to take a real laid back approach to this. So I think where I left off was how my sister and I coped with the situation, right? And early on, I was in therapy. Real early on, when I was a young kid, I always had big emotions and strong opinions, right? So I would war with my mom early on, like about nothing. Like I remember distinctly having like a almost like a chore chart but for behavior at home with my mom, like good day you got a star, like good in the morning star, good in the afternoon star, good in the evening star, 3 stars special treat, like week of all good days, like McDonald's. I remember distinctly, so I was in therapy
For
and
your
family
mom or for you?
therapy
I'm sorry.
for right. Both. The treat was me behaving,
Please
right.
go ahead. I'm sorry. I had to put it
Yeah,
down.
no, that was great. So, essentially, like, it was both myself and my mom, and like us together in therapy very early on. My sister, on the other hand, didn't have that. She was too young at that point to require therapy. I mean, I think they, put her in just when my parents got divorced to like have playtime with the therapist a few times, but she just had no interest. And my parents were very much about allowing us to follow who we were as human beings, as long as we were maintaining like honest contact with them and doing, the next right thing for ourselves. That's what they were about nurturing. And that's a hard balance to strike when the rubber meets the road and there's some turbulence in a child's life as heavy as the turbulence that my sister and I were about to face. Um, so that's where I'll leave off on that. That was our early childhood traumas for both of us, real early childhood, right?
There's
Now,
only one question I have about that, if you don't
mm-hmm.
mind me asking.
No, go ahead.
You talked about going to meetings. Did you ever end up going to anything like Al-Anon or?
I did not. And I think that would have been really helpful, Steve, because I didn't know a single other kid that had a mom that was in recovery or a dad that was in recovery. I didn't see other kids at the meetings. Even then, it wasn't that common to bring kids to meetings. But
Yeah.
I would say sitting in the meetings really benefited me as far as keeping me away from drinking and drugs, and self destructive behavior until I hit my own personal breaking point. Like logically, I knew always from a young age that that was just not the answer. It caused this problem for this person and that problem for that person. And now they have to go to these meetings every couple of days. It was just a thing in that sense that strengthened the stability of my early childhood.
Right. So let's talk more about what happens after that, because there seems to be a
Yeah.
big event that occurs.
For both my sister and I, and it's weird because there have been so many synchronicities and strange like timing occurrences in my life with my sister in relation to my sister, right? In the life of the Key family, it's incredible. Too much to encapsulate in one conversation, to be honest.
Okay.
But essentially, what happened was I was about 13 years old. I was really into music. So I was into school and I was into music. I was a singer. I got into singing in the chorus and in talent shows and at like family events, funerals, and the like, believe it or not. When I was about 7 or 8 years old, I had a music teacher that heard me singing in class and was like, "Oh, you should try out for the talent show." And I was off and running. My dad had wanted me to start playing guitar because, as a singer, you should probably have an instrument to back yourself up. So he had gotten
Sure.
me lessons first at a place here in town and then at the Music Nook in Milford, Massachusetts. I don't know if the Music Nook still exists, believe it
It
or
does
not, but
not. Absolutely. I
yeah.
drive by it well, where it used to be. I drive by it
Yeah,
every.
it's like a store for music still, but it's definitely not the Music Nook. So essentially I was taking lessons there. And at a certain point, my teacher was going to leave and we needed to find a new teacher, right? Being that he was a firefighter and was at the department with the guys all the time, had this gentleman that worked for him that he had actually known for quite a while. He had known this kid since he was 8 years old, and this kid looked up to him as kind of a father figure. And actually, my father apparently was part of the reason that this kid decided to become a firefighter in the first place. So he was like kicking around playing guitar in the day room, and my dad came across that a bunch of times, and eventually, in passing, had told him that I was looking for a teacher. And this gentleman asked him to bring me by, and just said, like, why don't you bring her by and we can play and see if we get along, maybe I can give her some lessons. So at that point, my dad started bringing me by, and I came by like maybe once every couple of weeks. We'd sit, we'd play guitar, I'd sing, again, just in the day room at the fire department. And eventually it was decided that it was working out, and this kid would start giving me lessons.
Sure.
So my dad had it set up where I would come to the department and we would do a lesson once a week. Now that would have been fine if that's how that continued to work out. However, over time, me and this kid, and I'll call him a kid. He was not a kid. I think I said a few minutes ago he was 23, 24 years
Yeah,
old.
it's an
I was
adult.
at this point, yep, I was at this point
You're 15 and he's an adult.
13, 14. Yeah, he was 10 years older than me,
Okay.
a full 10 years older than me. So essentially, I developed a relationship with him where I looked up to him as a mentor in the music world and basically as a friend. And eventually I developed a girlhood, like childhood crush on this man. Now, I'll reiterate, I had a pretty straight edge demeanor at that point in time. I had a strong Christian upbringing, although we weren't like religious. I went to church every Sunday, and at that time believed that it was appropriate for me to remain a virgin until I was married. So I had no
Sure.
experience with boys. I was a true kid, you know what I mean, with a childhood crush. Unfortunately, as I later found out, I was dealing with a predator. To be quite frank, and this kid, he saw that I had taken a liking to him, and he started to groom me. And when I say groom me, I mean he took advantage of the fact that we were close and I looked up to him and was developing this crush, and started to drive the conversation towards him and I being a thing. Now, again, at this point in time, I had just turned 14, right? So over a 6 month period of time, roughly, it transitioned from he simply brought this up and started to steer the conversation in that direction, to we moved into having a sexual relationship. And that was a very intricate and long and drawn out process. So, I mean, it started with just gaining my trust as a human being, like as a guy that was on my dad's department, that my dad had obvious respect for, and that respected my dad as a successful musician because he was a talented musician. Who would bring me to his band practices and let me play at his shows. He would come out to the open mic nights that I was starting to sing at. I was getting into the blues genre, and it was just like a really special time in my life. So that's how the relationship started out. It was very like kosher, like wholesome, right?
Right.
And then it started to be a thing where I would just, as young kids do, teenage girls do, ask him advice on like what was going on in my life with my friends and with guys eventually. And then he started to give said advice. And it got pretty graphic pretty quick when it came to that piece of the grooming. So he started saying things like, I understand that you don't want to have sex before marriage, but in all reality, no guy is going to want to be with you if you don't put out in this day and age. Then he said, there are several different types of having sex. It's not just having sex. There's like having sex, making love, and effing, in the interest of YouTube and Spotify.
You can say
And
fucking it's fine.
Okay, so there's having sex, there's making love, and there's fucking, right? And I was just eating this information up because at that point, again, it was just in general about boys, and it made me uncomfortable. The knowledge that like perhaps no guy would be interested in me unless I would put out. I didn't want to put out, but like it was good to know. I didn't have any other like older trusted male to like ask this stuff, you know.
Right.
Um, so eventually it steered into like, so who's the oldest guy you've ever liked? That's the moment that I really truly remember. And I did admit at that point that I had a crush on him. And he said that he had similar feelings. And this is the other thing I remember. What he said was, unfortunately, even though like I genuinely have feelings for you and like you clearly have a crush on me, right? Like, uh, we can't do that. It's wrong. It's illegal. Like, and I specifically remember him saying, like, it's illegal. Like, we might understand it, but it's illegal.
Yeah.
And he started right then to talk about the consequences of doing something like that. And I don't even think this exists anymore, but he was like, you and I would both be working at Christie's for the rest of our lives. Like, forget your like career, like aspirations, your hopes and dreams. Like, forget your father's career. Like, everybody would think you're a whore. Like, you know what I mean? My relationship would be ruined because, again, he had a relationship at that time.
Right.
And I knew this woman, and I liked this woman. I looked up to her as like an older, like confidant, so I felt weird about my feelings for him to begin with.
Yeah.
But never did I think in my crush that like he would be interested, and never did I expect it to go that way, if that makes sense. um Now, I'll never forget that at that point, my dad really like trusted me with him. We'd been having lessons for at least 9 months, a year. He'd been in this grooming, process with me for like what I now know to be grooming anyway, for like 6 months, right?
Right.
Um,
Unfortunately, they hide that really well, and the grooming
yeah,
process is not something that most people notice until it's too late.
yeah. I mean, it starts off with like, wow, you're just like really mature for your age. It's like easy to talk to you, or like most girls aren't like that. And like, you know what I mean? Like, it's just so anyway. So basically, I remember my dad had allowed us to have lessons like privately now. Like, he would drop me off at this man's apartment. I would go to band practices with this man. So on the way to band practice one night, he like reached over and like put his hand on my leg. And I remember like being so like just the feeling of just not knowing what to do, and I didn't say anything. And I think that was the thing that gave him the go ahead to like really move it to the next level. He asked me to sit on his lap. And I don't remember the timeline, if it was that same night or if it was another night. But he asked me to sit on his lap.
The
um
freeze response in trauma is something they
yeah.
count on.
Yeah, he asked me to sit on his lap at the studio, his band studio, one night. And I remember he got an erection apparently, but I didn't notice it. And he said, oh, like, see what you do to me. And I was like, genuinely, like, no, like, what are you talking about? And he was like, well, you didn't know it. You know what I mean? Like, it started getting weird real quick after he put his hand on my leg and I allowed that. Um, so, and see how I say I allowed that? Like, I was a child, bro. Like,
Correct. I
you know
was
what I
gonna,
mean?
if I was your therapist, I would have noticed that immediately. But thank you for
Yep.
catching yourself.
No, self-awareness, man, and it's years of therapy. It's years of therapy, and language is key. You'll hear me say survivor instead of victim a lot. That's a thing that I've been trying to retrain my brain on, because again, language is important. So
You're a survivor of something that happened to you.
yes, thank you.
It's not something that you had any control over because this person should have known better. So your
Sorry about the
support,
dog.
the support dog is here, so we're good.
Yeah, she is like, somebody is walking up the stairs outside. I'm not about it. So yeah, so at the end of the day, right, that was really the moment that it started to go, south for me. I feel like in that situation, right? Um, I had no idea what to do with any of that. It was simultaneously shameful and scary and exciting, like,
Mhm.
and I didn't know what to do. And for the first time in my life, I couldn't talk to anybody about it.
I was gonna say it's a
Not
secret, right?
not a single soul. For the first time in my life. Anything, right? Like, anything that ever happened, I could go to specifically who? My dad with. And this particular situation, my dad was the last person I could go to with any of it. I couldn't tell anybody, not a friend, not a family member, not somebody at school, because he made me very well aware that, like, people can't know.
Yeah,
Um,
I think they count on secrecy, and there's a difference between secrecy and privacy, and secrecy is something bad.
yeah.
And he definitely probably groomed you into keeping that secret.
Yeah, and the other thing is, it was weird, like, in public, he would, like, ignore me almost, right? But, like, everybody knew we were super close, and I remember thinking, like, "That's weird, bro, like, you're making it weird," you know what I mean? Even at that young age, like, it's just the lengths these people go to, like, now looking back on it, it's insane. And at the time, you have to remember, this is the late '90s, early 2000s. The only type of rape that exists is the creepy uncle or the guy jumping out of the bushes with a gun to your head.
Right.
That's the only type of rape that exists in my mind at that time. This was before the Catholic priest scandal. This was before all of that, right?
Right.
So essentially, right, I remember that it was getting to the point where it was obvious, like, we were gonna, like, make out, like, something was gonna happen. That's in my mind what I thought was gonna happen. And we had, like, this plan to, like, do it at, like, guitar practice, like, before we were gonna go to a blues jam, actually, and we were going to have dinner with my father and this kid's fiance, right? So I chickened out at the last second. I didn't want to do it, right? And I told him that I didn't want to do it, and I spoke up, right? And he actually gave me a positive response to that. He was like, "You know what? You're right. Like, this is a bad idea. Like, thanks for, like, being the voice of reason." And he kissed me on the forehead because I'm a child, right? And he said, "Gold star." And, like, these are the things that stick out, right? So we went to the studio instead, had band practice, whatever, whatever. And I thought about that moment the entire time. For some reason, I'm like, why do I suck so much? Why am I such a bitch? Like, why can't I just, like, sack up and do this, right? And so eventually I was like, you know what? Let's just go back to your place. Now, again, I'm thinking that we're gonna, like, make out. What ends up happening is he brings me in the bedroom. We start kissing, right? And he takes my pants down and he performs oral sex on me. He nothing had I didn't know this was coming, right? I had
Mhm.
no idea. I was staring at the ceiling, thinking about how I was about to go to dinner with my dad and his fiance the entire time. And when he was done, because again, I'm not moving, I'm not saying anything. He's like, "Okay, I'm done. You can pull your pants up." And then we proceeded to go to dinner with my dad and his fiance. And I think that's the best way to describe what ended up happening for the next year. Around the time that I was turning 15, shortly before it progressed into, like, an actual, vaginal
Sexual intercourse.
sexual intercourse, right? And I remember he said that if he got engaged, we would stop. That happened. We didn't stop. And I'm just feeling more and more guilt and more shame. And I'm getting more and more like, I'm not talking to anybody about this. I'm writing, though, and that's key. That's clutch for me, right? I'm writing, and I still have these notebooks, Steve, of all the lyrics and poetry and just random thoughts that I wrote down. That was my venting. And I truly believe that's why I'm able to do anything else to this day. Like, I really believe that's the foundation of my sanity. The difference between why I was able to remain relatively sane and some other people, or I could have broken, like, truly broken.
Right.
Um, and I don't mean that to be disrespectful. Like, trauma affects everybody different, you know. But
Trauma's
for me,
trauma.
yeah, luckily I had that outlet. So at a certain point, it came to critical mass, and I straight said to this man, because once this started happening, there were no guitar lessons. At no point did I ever receive a guitar lesson. It was just strictly business, right? And it was
Right.
strictly business. I mean, this man made the comment that I was like a dead fish in bed. And I'm thinking in my 14-year-old head, I don't want to be here having sex with you. I'm having sex with you because that's how I keep you around, right? You
Right.
told me yourself that's how I keep you around, right? Um, so eventually I say to this man, I thought we were, first it was, I thought we were going to stop when you got engaged. Then it was, I thought we were going to stop. Like, what is going on? This is about July of the year I was 15. So that would have been July of 2001,
So that
right?
went on for a long time.
Yeah, it went on for a
Mm.
year, at least once a week. At one incident happened in the actual fire station. There was another near miss in the fire station where we almost got caught in the fire station.
Jesus.
My best friend to this day, who was another firefighter's daughter, remembers that. She brought it up. I had forgotten, but now, like, the second she said, "Remember the time my father and I almost caught you?" I went, "Jesus Christ, yes, I do. Holy shit!" Because it was,
Yeah.
yeah. So essentially I just got sick of it. I couldn't handle it anymore. I felt so guilty. I felt so shameful. I was so confused. I was so sick of doing something I didn't want to do. Just the Christian thing was a huge thing of the shame. My father and our relationship was suffering. I was starting to not be able to like get to school on time. School was super important to me. I had come out the side of my neck a little bit and talked to one or two friends about it. And finally, right, I just reached a critical mass. I reached a breaking point, and I said, that was actually the time I had the second conversation with him where I said, "Are we really like going to stop this? Like, seriously, you said we were going to stop 6 months ago. Like, it hasn't happened. I don't know what to do. I can't do this anymore." And his whole thing was always, "Don't worry. Like, when you're old enough, I'll ask your dad if we can be together. And this other relationship is just a cover." And so,
Wow. Really, like all the stuff that's just creepy and wrong.
yeah. So essentially, I remember vividly when I asked him that second time, he said, "I just can't resist you." And I knew in that moment when I went to camp that summer, I was reporting it. I couldn't fucking do it anymore, Steve. I just couldn't do it anymore. And I was
Good
going
for
to
you.
snap. And that was that. So I planned. That was the last time I saw him. And I planned at camp, I'm going to tell somebody. And in my mind, it was, it's going to stop. I'm going to make it stop. Now, I will touch on the fact that I had actually told my mother 3 months prior. And that was because I was so bottled up inside about it and I had nobody else to turn to. And my mother is the most fucked up human being I know, right? And she wants to get on my good side, right? So if I ask her to, she'll keep this information and she'll give me some friggin' advice.
Right.
So I did. I said, "Hey, mom, I've got like something big to talk to you about, and I need you to promise me, like on God, like right now, like you will not tell a soul on all things holy. Like I swear I will never talk to you again. I need you to keep that." Now, people might judge my mother for that. I needed that in that moment, Steve, because what my mother did was she provided me a sounding board to get it out. She made me understand that I was not, she didn't have the reaction of, "Oh my God, you're being raped." What she had the reaction was, "Oh my God, that's awful. You can't be doing that. That is not good for you or him or your
Right.
dad. We need to make it stop." Now, you have to understand, my mother at 16 had a 26-year-old Hell's Angel boyfriend at dinner with her parents. Like it was a different
Right.
time. People didn't understand, and that was also grooming and rape, but again, different time.
So what happens at the
Um,
camp?
so what happens at the camp is I'm actually there that year with two of my best friends. I had brought them to camp for the first time. I'd been going to this camp. It's a Christian camp in New Hampshire since I was 8 years old. Brought them up to the camp. Um, I decided halfway through the 2 week camp, like I targeted like the pastor I was gonna confess my sins to, because this is the way I viewed it, right? Um, I truly mean that, Steve. I really thought like I need to get this off my chest to God, can cleanse myself of my sins and make it
Right.
stop. Like, oof, I haven't thought about that aspect of this in a really long time. So anyway, I go to this gentleman after nightly worship. My friends like file out of the church, and I had told one of them what was going on, and I had told her that I was gonna report the situation. So I told this guy what was going on. I was like, "Listen, this is what's going on. I don't know what to do. I feel so guilty. I'm sinning. I need to make it stop. Um, I know if I come here and I tell you, you as a mandated reporter, like have to make it stop." And he just was like, "Lynn, I know you don't understand this, but that is, you're being raped." And
Right.
I was like, "What are you talking about, bro?" Literally had no concept. "What are you yeah, okay, buddy, just make it stop. I have no idea what you're talking about." Like, no, he never held me down. No, I never said no. You know what I mean? Like, no concept whatsoever.
Yeah, the concept of consent is something I talk about to just about everyone, and
Mm.
it needs to be talked about more often. But when we don't know, we don't know, right?
Right. It was weird. It was a weird moment for me, but all I knew was, right, it was going to stop. And so the way it was going to stop was my dad was going to become involved. And that's what you have to understand here is this was the thing that I couldn't go to my dad with, but my dad was the person that I went to with stuff.
Yeah.
So I didn't know this was like a guy that was close enough to him that the day I left for camp, they went for beers. Like they were super close. So what happened was the camp called my mom, because I said, look, you're going to want to call my mom first. My mom already knows. And they were like, what? And I was like, yeah, that's a long story. I explained it, whatever. My mom was cooperative from the get. She, believe me, she redeems herself fully for whatever perceived wrong she committed by not immediately telling someone.
Right.
So essentially, she told my father. My father touched base via phone and said that he was going to center himself and come up tomorrow, but that, everything was going to be okay. We were going to work this out just like we always do. Right. Like, thank you for, sharing that type thing. Right.
Right.
So I waited with bated breath for my dad to get up to New Hampshire. Now, behind the scenes, my dad was freaking out. He's like, there's got to be some mistake. This can't be what the heck? You know what I mean?
Denial.
Like, he freaking out. Right.
Well,
So
that's
I'm sitting.
denial. That's not
Yeah.
abnormal for people
Mm-hmm.
who go through this. I'm not supporting it. I'm just noting it.
No, you're 100% right. You're 100% right. That's what the picture I'm trying to paint. I'm glad I'm doing an okay job with that. So essentially, he comes up and I'm sitting in the office at the camp and I'm waiting and I'm sitting there and I'm kind of like this. I've like got my head in my hands and my dad walks in and I don't look up. I'm like
Mhm.
terrified and afraid and ashamed.
I was going to
Right.
say the shame is a powerful,
Mm-hmm.
powerful emotion.
Yeah, and ashamed and terrified is really the order of operations there, because
Right.
I wasn't afraid of what my dad was going to do. I just didn't know what was going to happen. You
Right.
know.
That I got.
Um.
Yeah.
So I'll never forget this. And this is a key moment. He picked my head up in his hands, like got down on his hands, like on his knees, picked my head up in his hands, and looked and went, "Baby, don't ever hang your head in shame. I don't ever want to see you hang your head in shame about this ever again. You did nothing wrong and you have nothing to be ashamed of." And he said that in the moment that he walked in and he saw me, he knew right then, this is not a mistake. Something happened here. So to me, it was over. It was over. It was over. Hallelujah. It's done. You're going to stay the rest of camp. That's what, these are people that support you. That's the best thing to do in this situation. We'll talk more about it when we get home. Right. And little did I know that was just the beginning, Steve. That was just the beginning. So when I say this is like such an intricate story, that's just the first piece of my personal story.
But so just not that I want to hear, not that I don't want to hear more, but I
Mhm.
might ask more direct questions
Of
because
course, please
interest in
do.
time.
Mhm.
So do you end up having to do anything with this, go to court or what have you?
Yeah. So essentially, my dad set up a meeting with a detective in town, and I sat with that detective and I told him what happened. And this detective, explained to me that what I experienced, whether I realized it or not, was rape, and that people like that don't just do that one time, and that it was in the best interest of myself and everyone around me that I, speak to the DA. And I was not about it. I wasn't about ruining someone's life for a dumb decision that I made. That's how I felt. And
Blaming yourself, huh?
yeah, and the way the detective put it was, and this is a formative moment as well. He said, "Listen, Lynn, your sister is about the age that you were right now when you met him, right?" I said, "Yeah." He goes, "How would you feel if this happened to her?" And I was like, "Fuck you, Donnie." I literally said, "Fuck you, Donnie." Like, no.
Right.
Because you have to remember, I've been the one that fights all the battles. I fight all the battles. I'm against my mom and these men in the house, and like, and my sister's over here. She's protected. That's my sister. You don't fuck with my sister, right?
Right. So
Um,
they go through the investigation.
yeah, and so essentially what happened was I had it was a lot and then it stopped. So I had a white room, as my friend calls it, like interrogation or interview deposition with the DA. The DA made the comment that I would have had to go to school and get a degree to make up a story like that, because the level of grooming was so intense and that there was no way that this man was a first time offender, and that they were 100% going to pursue it. And then things just kind of ground to a halt. I had trouble getting a restraining order against this man. I had to fight that every 3 months in court. That was because I couldn't check the box that said I was in a relationship with him at the time. The harassment order statute did not exist. And the really key thing here, Steve, to note is that about a year after I reported, my sister was violently raped by the 26-year-old boyfriend of her friend's older sister. The friend was 16. This boyfriend was 26. He was a gang member and a drug dealer. He lured her with alcohol away from the house, and together they violently raped her. Um,
So basically, you go through your own rape
mhm.
several times. You go and speak to the right people, and suddenly your sister gets raped also.
Yes, and that was the one thing I was trying to prevent, in a sense. When I went forward with my pursuit of justice, of healing through the justice system, as I like to try to call it, right?
Yeah, good luck with that.
I know, because it to me it's re-traumatizing, but they do their best, and I did receive justice. I mean, I received a conviction. My sister received a conviction. That's more than a lot of women get,
But
unfortunately.
but with conviction and all
Mm,
that stuff, there's
mm-hmm.
consequences on the people. People. What I kind of explained with the criminal justice system is that what we see is there's a conviction took place, or they went to court, or what have
Mm-hmm.
you, and then it's
Yep.
over. Well, no,
Yes.
that's not at
Yeah.
all how that works.
Not at all. And it, unfortunately, in the case of my family, it wasn't how it worked at all. So with my sister's case, that went quick because it was a violent crime, right? My crime, you have to remember, was an odd situation for the time. Again, before the Catholic priest scandal, right? When
Right,
this type of rape became more mainstream, like in the mainstream awareness, because it's always gone on.
right.
So it's, in fact, it's the most common type of rape, is that type of rape, a grooming
100%.
situation.
Yes.
But anyway, so with the violent situation my sister was in, that went forward very quickly. And she went through a very traumatic trial. She was on the stand for a few hours. Now, she was 12 at the time of the event. She was 14 at the time of the trial. They were grilling her on consent, because part of hers was the forcible part. So they were like, okay, they had sex, but was it forcible? And they're grilling this 14-year-old girl on consent. Um, this man sodomized my 12-year-old sister at knife point with his 16-year-old accomplice, and they're grilling her on consent.
Consent.
Um, I was both fortunately and fortunately not there. I had descended into my early stages of my first round of addiction, right, and I was actually at rehab. This man was told that the jury was coming back, right, my sister's offender, and he told his lawyer he was going to go downstairs to pray. So he was granted time to go downstairs to pray. So 20 minutes later, when the jury came back, they were looking for her offender, and he wasn't back. So the judge apparently granted him another 20 minutes to come up from praying. And 20 minutes later, they determined that he had run from the courthouse. Um, Now, through a series of events, he was not apprehended until a couple of years later by America's Most Wanted. I believe he was their 900th capture, and it was around that time that my case was finally going to trial.
Yeah.
It took about 4 or 5 years for my case to get to trial, because a DA that worked for the Middlesex district attorney's office, apparently, this is what I'm told, had just kind of put some of the more difficult cases on the back burner. And when my family looked into it, he was found to have put a bunch of cases like that on the back burner, and he resigned. So I'm told. I could be wrong about that information, but my case was
No,
then assigned.
but this is the other problem too, is that
Mm-hmm.
you go through whatever again, to me, violent rape
Mm-hmm.
versus uh statutory or like grooming. To me, that's all rape. I mean, I
Yes.
put it all on the same page for me personally. Number
Yeah.
one.
I mean,
Uh,
it is.
Number two, people do these things and then they don't get a day in court for a year or two, and you don't grill the person who did it, you grill the victim of it, and that
Mm.
pisses me off to no ends. The criminal justice system is just not like it, like I think that you mentioned it, I don't think on here yet, when we talk about the secondary trauma of the
Yes.
justice
Oh
system.
yeah.
It is
Oh yeah.
absolutely unbearable. I didn't know half your story, obviously, but I
Yeah.
do know about this, and I worked in courts for a long time, and it's just unbelievable what people go through. So
It is, and that's the thing, is that's why I started with the rape itself and then moved on to, and it was really just beginning for me, because it was just, again, originally fighting for the restraining order, just to get him to not be allowed near
and
me.
you weren't getting it.
And I wasn't getting it every 3 months, until finally he was indicted, at which point I got a lawyer and we got a year-to-year restraining order, and there was a stay away order attached to the arraignment, not indictment. But Well,
Yeah.
indictment and then arraignment, because it did go to grand jury in this particular
Yeah.
case. I've
The
learned
case,
a lot about the criminal justice system and the terminology, Steve. Sorry.
and then the case is hold way different than getting a restraining order, because that's like two
Yes,
different things.
exactly. So at that point, it's like, this court date, that court date, they made a mistake and didn't collect DNA off of my first deposition. And when I said, hey, we have DNA evidence, you didn't check the fire department where he left DNA evidence. I could point out where he left it. I said that in my original deposition. I thought you guys checked that. Yeah, no, they hadn't. Like I had to point that out myself, and they got that. And in, I believe, a 50 by 100-foot room, I pointed out a 5 by 5 square foot area, and they found his DNA on it. And then it was just court date after court date with nothing happening. At which point, my sister had already been raped, and she was coming to the summation of her case, and then he ran, and it was just insane. So when I finally got assigned a new ADA, and this was the head of the child sex abuse division in the county at the time, because they were serious now. They were like, we're not messing this up again. It had been a while. It had been like 4 years. My sister's person was still on the run at this point in time, and then my first trial was a mistrial. And when I say it was a mistrial, they pulled the jury after the fact, and one juror would not vote guilty, and they sent that jury back 3 days, 3 whole days, 3 days of deliberations, and one juror would not vote guilty, so they had to call a mistrial. So that was a fun time. That was terrible. It was awful. I was devastated. I had waited 4 long years for a trial and one juror. So then they offered him a plea bargain, and they offered him no jail time whatsoever and 1 count guilty, the other 3 hanging over his head. He wouldn't take it. Which I was pissed they offered him no jail time, but in the eyes of the state, they wanted to wrap this up. At least he'd be a registered sex offender. You know what I mean?
Right.
So we went back for a second trial, and at that trial, he was found guilty. I could go into the way that trial was a circus. His whole defense rested on the fact that he had a lovely and talented and intelligent fiance, and he did. But that has nothing to do with whether or not you're raping your 15-year-old guitar student.
As podcast goes, I want to make sure I tell everyone here that it's not more about not wanting to hear more, because I think that's so important, but because of a kind of a time limitation.
Yes.
I tell people that, on average, a human being has a 45-minute to 60-minute attention span.
Yes.
And we're getting close to that hour right now already.
Right. I know. It's
So
crazy. It almost really does have to be broken. And I'm sorry, like, it just is the nature of this story. It almost
I
has to
know,
be
look,
broken into parts.
like Lynn, if you got to apologize to me, you've got it all wrong. I'm apologizing to you, just
Okay.
because I think that we'll probably have to do a second part. But
Okay.
maybe what we can do to just wrap up this first part, because this is kind of like what happened to you, what happened to your sister,
Yes.
the conviction, and then maybe we can talk about the secondary trauma of the
Yes.
legal system, your issues with sobriety and recovery because of all that, among other things. Obviously, I don't want to
Yes.
singularly blame it on one thing, because it's never that easy. But
Yes.
what I'd like to do right now is to just, if you could tell me a little bit about, what would you change about the system if you could right now, like today, on we're in June of 2023, this comes out in July. What could you do? What could we do to change the system so that the victims feel supported? Because I know about victim advocates,
hmm
I know all that stuff, but there's still like a lot of like cracks in the foundation here.
So many, so many. So I would say the number one thing is early intervention with adequate trauma treatment. That is the number one thing. And if we're talking about the original trauma of going through the secondary trauma of the justice system, right? Because there's 2 pieces to this, Steve. That's how intricate this is, right?
Yeah.
Um, that's the most important thing. Also, just connecting with a good advocate. My advocate is still working with me to this day, 20 years later, is absolutely critical. But it's early and adequate access to trauma treatment.
Early
I didn't
access.
have
Yeah.
that. I didn't have that. To be honest, I mean, I did have my regular therapist. That wasn't going to cut it for this. I did have a rape crisis center that offered, I think, 3 appointments. That wasn't going to cut it for this. I needed a holistic and individualized and trauma informed approach, and that was just not the case. That wasn't available at the time, essentially.
So
Um,
then I'm going to invite you to come back,
okay,
because I definitely think we need to continue this story.
okay.
I didn't want, I don't want to seem abrupt to you or any of my
No, I'm
audience, people who know me. I like to listen to people's story. I want to tell your story, but we'll probably need to do a second part.
Yeah, well, this one is a lot. It sprawls because this is the if this was it, this would already be a lot because we're nearing the end. You know,
It's
I
never
did get a
it.
conviction, and my sister did get a conviction even after America's Most Wanted. Right? We wrapped it up in a nice, neat little bow. That's part one. Part two comes over the next 20 years, and then how the consequences that these offenders are supposed to have and the protections that survivors are supposed to have actually play out in the real world. So
Yeah.
that is all stuff that is a whole other another piece of this, and that's why I always start with it's something you couldn't write if you tried. Like if there was a movie being made, right, and the director got and the producer got a script with all the twists and turns and plot twists, really, right? They'd be like, no, way too much. You've lost credibility and believability, you know. But it's just unfortunately sometimes life is stranger than fiction, and this one is just it's been a web, man. It's been
I've
a web between mine and my sister's lives.
Some people have asked me about my, my work as a therapist for years. I work a lot with trauma. I worked on a crisis team, worked in the community justice system on all levels that you can imagine. And I had people ask me, what type of stories would you give? I said, none of them would make TV because they'd say it's too unbelievable.
Yes.
And so I fully understand that. And your story is not over. So how about we put a pause on it? I want to thank you for the first part today.
Thank you so
And I
much.
hope we're going to have you back, and have the second part where we're going to talk about 20 years later and what
Yes.
happened during those 20 years, including, the sobriety recovery, the struggles with that, the struggles with the Sex Offender Registry Board, or SORB as they call it in
Hmm.
Massachusetts, and all other things. But I wanted to thank you for today's time. I really truly appreciate it.
Oh no, thank you. No, seriously, I'm honored, and so grateful for the opportunity, Steve.
And I will definitely find some time. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you.